Right, we have, and it's unusual for us to do an interview after 9, but because our next guest is in Australia and there are time differences, it worked out. You know, I was lambasting the Law Society the other day for throwing out the report or calling for submissions on their independent legal review panel and then refusing to come on and talk about it. Well, clearly they had a discussion. And one of the people, and the issue that I have raised is that there appears in the recommendations to be a desire or the possibility of a law change in regards to the Conveyancing and Law Practitioners Act that would make some mention or recognition of the Treaty of Waitangi. And this seems curious to me, as the Law Society and lawyers have no obligation specifically under the so-called principles of the Treaty of Waitangi or the treaty itself. They were not signatories to it. So where has all this come from, and what is being recommended? What is the change being recommended by this independent legal review panel of the Law Society? To find out, we are joined now by Ron Paterson, lawyer, who is the chair of the aforesaid independent law review panel. Ron, thank you for joining us from across the ditch.
Good morning. I'm joining you from Catherine, 320k south of Darwin. So, yep, good to talk to you, Sean.
Middle of nowhere.
Absolutely.
All right.
Back holiday.
All right, you're on holiday. Okay. Ron, I first want to ask you, the review panel that you headed, that you chaired, what were you briefed in broad terms with doing?
Right, so just to be clear, so it's a review panel of 3. I'm the chair of it. I'm a long-time professor at the University of Auckland. Jane Mears, an experienced barrister, a former partner of Chris Finderson's from Wellington, and Jacinta Ruru, a leading Māori academic from the University of Otago. So we were briefed after the profession had been consulted to review whether there should be a new regulatory framework for lawyers in New Zealand. And as part of that, we were asked to consider whether there should be a reference to treaty, the treaty, in the regulatory framework.
Who suggested that you should ask that question?
That was suggested by an independent. The Law Society went through quite a big consultation process with a group of members of the profession back in 2021. It was sort of over a 6-month period, and they consulted with the profession, and they came up with these terms of reference. I think the board at that time was mindful that there needed to be a fresh look, and there were reasons for that. Partly was all the issues around sexual misconduct.
The Russell McVeigh stuff, yeah. So you asked whether or not your disciplinary or your regulations were fit for purpose. I'm trying to figure out where the treaty came into this.
Well, I think where that came. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I think where that came into was the other bigger piece of it was, and really the key of part of our report is whether the Law Society should continue to be both the regulator setting the rules for lawyers, but also the representative body. Which is very odd. I mean, you don't have that in any other profession in New Zealand except the teachers. And what's happened internationally is all the countries we compare ourselves with have, except Scotland, are still resisting, but the United Kingdom, Australia, and certainly in New South Wales and Victoria and Canada, they'd all moved away from that model. So that was the main focus. Yeah. But as you might expect in New Zealand in 2021, when they were setting this up, they said, and we should probably look at where the treaty fits in because
Who said that? Who said that?
That was in the terms of reference.
Okay, and who wrote the terms of reference?
It was in the terms of reference. It was called a steering group that was appointed by the Law Society. And I guess in fairness to them, they were probably recognising that under the New Zealand legislation guidelines say if you're going to have a new statute, you have to look at whether it is it's required to be consistent with the treaty.
Yeah, but hang on, the Law Society doesn't have to be consistent with the treaty.
No, the Law Society doesn't. But if there was going to be a new regulator, a new statutory entity, if that were to be created...
But there isn't
then
at the moment, right? There isn't.
No, but the main so there are two main recommendations in this report, right?
Yep.
One, that we should have a new regulator, that we should split. The New Zealand Law Society should no longer be the body that is the regulator of lawyers.
Yeah.
There should be a new body, call it what you will, and the Law Society can continue in its honourable tradition, and it's done a fine job of representing the interests of lawyers. So that was the first recommendation. The second one, and you probably had listeners raise this with you in the past, that the complaint system for lawyers is antiquated.
Yeah, it is. It's terrible.
And it doesn't serve the interests. And so we're the second.
You guys get away with, not quite murder, but geez, I've done some stories, and lawyers and law societies have covered up terrible, terrible malfeasance by your members.
Well, the system, it's not a good system. And at the moment, the Law Society, they're trying to work within a framework, that doesn't really work. And I think part of the reason I was asked to chair this is that I had a lot of experience, including... So
you're saying the two major recommendations are new complaints procedure and actually splitting off the regulatory operations of the Law Society and giving it to whom?
Absolutely.
Giving it to whom?
To a new regulator. So the equivalent,
which would be a government a government body or not?
It would be a point. In our country, under Parliament, there'd be a statute, and the responsible minister would be responsible for appointing, the members.
And what has the Treaty of Waitangi got to do? What has the Treaty of Waitangi got to do with any of that?
So let's be really clear that the issue that people have been worried about, I think, and I can understand why, is whether individual lawyers would have some new obligation. That's what the debate's been about. That's what Chris Finderson and others have been talking about.
I'm not sure that it is, but you say that's what they were talking about.
Well, it is. I've read what they said.
But that recommendation was rejected, and they know that it was rejected.
Well, it wasn't at all clear in the debate. They
were clear yesterday. Chris Finderson was clear about that yesterday. So that's off the table.
Chris Finderson was.
Yeah. So
that's a really
what is left
point.
about the treaty? No. Ron, what you're doing now is setting up a straw man, and I've already said that straw man's gone. No. What is about the Treaty of Waitangi in your recommendations?
So what we've said in relation to that is that given that if there's going to be a new statute, which we've recommended, then consistent with the requirement under legislation guidelines, there should be a treaty reference so that the regulator, the entities that are set up, and the main one will be this new body that's set up, but we also have a Council for Legal Education, and we also have a disciplinary tribunal, so they'd have to work all that through. And we've said that there should be a reference. Now, we use the wording that's the current wording that's being used, but whatever wording is used, that will be an issue ultimately for government.
So hang on. No, you didn't get to the vinegar stroke there, Ron. There must be reference to observing or being consistent with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi in a new regulator for lawyers.
Yeah, so wording we said.
And my question to you, now that we've finally got there, why, Ron?
Why? Because we're in 2023, because our Supreme Court has said that tikanga is first law in this country, because this is a statute dealing with the regulatory framework for lawyers in this country. And so that the notion that you might have a statement, such as the sort of statement that was in 6 of the statutes passed by the key English government and 60 other pieces of legislation.
Man, you are advocating for this, Ron. You aren't independent. You've got a clear view, as I'm sure Jacinta Ruru has a clear view. Ron, I'm asking you what the Treaty of Waitangi, which creates obligations on the Crown and Māori, what that has got to do with the administration of law and lawyers in New Zealand, which is based, I presume, on the rule of our normal law and the idea of equity between the law, before the law.
Absolutely.
What are the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi? We don't even know what they are. And you're saying tikanga is the preeminent justice or law in New Zealand. I'm sorry, Ron, this is incredibly radical, what you're proposing and talking about.
Well, well, what you're saying is that the Supreme Court is incredibly radical. But let's just come back.
And maybe I am wrong. Maybe I am saying that wrong.
But why don't we? Let's come back. Come back to the precise point of what difference would it make to the regulation.
And you saying it would make no difference then? Why bother doing it, Ron?
No, I'm not saying it would make no difference. So what I'm saying, and what we say in the report is, okay, and I'm on a PDF copy of the report on my partner's phone. I'm just trying to look at it. We just say we envisage changes in regulatory practice and decision making, including that the new body would partner with Māori, for example, Te Hungaroa Māori, which is effectively the Māori.
Why?
Side.
Why,
and how
Ron?
They do their
Why should lawyers and the legal profession partner with Māori? It's not covered by the treaty, Ron.
Not lawyers, the new regulator, the new body.
Why should it? Why should it, Ron?
Because as a country, we have recognised, in our
No, we haven't, Ron. The woke lefties like you have, Ron. And the Parliament hasn't, actually. The Parliament didn't understand what it did. But people like your colleague, Professor Jacinta Ruru, have decided that's what we've done.
Well, I think anyway, yes, Jacinta Ruru has clear views. I think anybody who knows me would know that I'm no woke lefty. But coming back to your point, you say that, I'm talking about the Parliament. Why has the Parliament of this country passed 60 statutes that says that in some way we should recognise, if we're setting up a statutory entity, that's what we're talking about here, if we're creating a statutory entity, that it should work in partnership with Māori, or work as, for example, here.
What on earth would that achieve? And it wasn't envisaged when the treaty was signed. It's just ridiculous, Ron. The law should be the same for everyone.
The law should be the same for everyone, but you and I are not, we're not regulators. We're not the body that's set up by Parliament to regulate lawyers. So we're envisaging, and this, of course, there'll be a very healthy and appropriate debate about this. It's occurring right now in the profession. The Law Society will then have to decide whether to recommend, make recommendations to the minister. And whoever the minister is, whether it's this minister or a future minister, will have to decide whether that should go forward in legislation. And then it'll all go before the Parliament, before a select committee, and there'll be a great big debate.
What are the principles? You've said in this report that it's got to recognise the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Can you point me to where they're written down and how I can define them?
Look, I'm not going to sit here and get into that debate. Because you raised it. You chaired a committee that put out a report that mentioned the principles of Waitangi. Of the Treaty of Waitangi. I'm just trying to figure out what you were on about. I think it's a legitimate question, Ron. Well, it's a legitimate question, but I guess as a law professor and a lawyer, if I'm proposing a new statute, and I know that New Zealand's legislation guidelines require it, consistency with the Treaty of Waitangi.
The principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. What are the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi?
Well, obviously I'm familiar, as you are, with the whole notion of partnership and...
No. What are the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi that you mention in your report, Ron?
Look, I'm not going to continue there.
Ron, can you not answer that question? Because that would seem to me a fundamental problem with your report.
No, it's not a fundamental problem with the report at all. We're talking about a 193-page report. We're talking about a couple of pages.
Ron, I'm talking about what are the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi that you say any new act or any changes must be consistent with, and you can't tell me what the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi are, Ron. That's insane.
Right, so yes. Well, when I'm sitting here in Katherine, Northern Territory, no, I can't. But if I was back at my office,
Can you just point me to somewhere online I could search it and find them?
Yes.
Surely they must be codified somewhere.
Yep. So if you open the document that's from the Parliamentary Council Office for legislation guidelines, you will find, I haven't got the exact reference, but you'll find
so you're saying they're written down somewhere?
It's footnoted in the report, and you can look at it there.
Okay. All right, we'll go and have a look, because I've been looking for them for years, and I just cannot find what the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi are.
Sean, I hope it's helpful to you and to your listeners. Have a look there.
Ron, the final question before I leave you. Just why? What has the treaty got to do with the way lawyers do their jobs? Will it create a more just society?
Well, I think one thing and probably one of the key emphases of this report is, that we want our lawyers to be competent. And you use the word best interests or best interests of their clients. And that's a major focus. That's the one fundamental new obligation that we've proposed in this report. And in other legislation, including our health practitioners legislation, we talk about competence in practicing in 2023 includes meeting the needs of all your clients.
Yep.
And so meeting the needs of all your clients, including your Māori clients, including your Pacific clients, obviously, including your Asian clients, but it includes cultural competence. That's not a new or radical idea.
I'd rather have legal and professional competence, Ron. Cultural competence.
Well,
Who made up that term?
I think many of us would want both, actually.
Would we?
So, I think many people would.
What is cultural competence? See, Ron, every time I ask you a question, you come up with some new sort of critical race theory descriptor. Cultural competence. What the hell is cultural competence?
So in New Zealand's Code of Patients' Rights, you'll find there a reference to being able to meet the needs, including the cultural needs of different cultural ethnic.
Jeez, I don't want a doctor to meet my cultural needs. I want them to meet my medical needs, and I want a lawyer to meet my legal needs. Well,
communication for patients and for clients is really important, and being able to understand your context is important. That's not radical theory.
Yeah, and that's what a good doctor does, and they have always done, and what a good lawyer has always done, Ron. And they don't need... They don't need a codified step-by-step guide to say that they need to do that.
No, I don't. And this is not a code. This would be simply saying in the overarching framework, what you want, the fundamental obligation. But one of your obligations is that you maintain your professional competence. Those are the words that we use, including your cultural competence, and that's an aspect of being a culturally competent lawyer in this country. And so, for me, that's not radical. Clearly for you it is.
I think for a lot of New Zealanders it is, Ron. But I am going to say this. Thank you for taking time out from your holiday. I'm sorry to have disturbed you, but I thank you for at least talking to us this morning. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your trip in Aussie.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. That is Ron Paterson. He is... chair of the Independent Law Review Panel. So that was an explanation. Yes, a new regulatory body for lawyers, which would have to take account of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi that he says are written down somewhere. He doesn't sound like a bad rooster. But he's just so far down the rabbit hole, and every time, cultural competence. And it's really what we talked about with Elizabeth Rata. A whole way of thinking, a whole structure of insanity has come to be in this country since the late 1980s, which means a reasonable man like Ron Paterson actually believes what he's doing is right, and it's clearly not. Just remarkable. But I do say thank you, Ron, for fronting up. And I don't think there was any malice in what he did. He's just been brainwashed. I'm sorry.